Welcome to the Menominee Newscast. It's October 27th, 2021, and I'm your host, Mike Gurecki, bringing you the news and inspiration from nature's front line. Today we listen to some bioacoustic recordings that are informing Indigenous-led conservation efforts. The world is increasingly coming to recognize just how important Indigenous-led conservation and Indigenous land rights are if we're to address environmental crises like climate change and biodiversity loss. And for good reason. Studies have found that indigenous lands are home to about 80% of the world's biodiversity and have lower rates of deforestation and store more carbon than lands managed by governments. 2/3 of indigenous lands are still essentially natural, more than double the proportion of intact lands under other management regimes. Securing indigenous land rights is so vital that it's even considered key to the success of the world's vast and growing protected area network, because the close to 38 million square kilometers, or 14.6 million square miles of land across 87 countries over which indigenous peoples have ownership and use or management rights, overlap with about 40% of all terrestrial protected areas on Earth. But there is still a critical need for more acknowledgement of indigenous land rights. Indigenous and local communities customarily care for more than half of Earth's surface, but governments only formally recognize indigenous ownership of about 10% of global land. 218 gigatons, or 22% of the total carbon, in tropical and subtropical forests are found on lands managed by indigenous communities, but at least 1/3 of that carbon is in areas where indigenous peoples lack formal recognition of their land rights. We're discussing two projects today that would increase indigenous management of their traditional territories. We first speak with Stephanie Thorassie, Executive Director of the Seal River Watershed Alliance, a coalition of indigenous groups in Canada who are seeking to establish a new Indigenous Protected Area covering the 12 million acre or 4.9 million hectare Seal River Watershed in northern Manitoba. Thorassie tells us about the environmental and cultural importance of the watershed, the 4 First Nations and 1 Inuit organization that have come together to propose the Indigenous Protected Area, and discusses the importance of Indigenous-led conservation. We also speak with Jeff Wells, Vice President of Boreal Conservation for the National Audubon Society, which has partnered with the Seal River Watershed Alliance to study the watershed's importance to wildlife, especially migratory songbirds. Wells plays us some bioacoustic recordings of birds in the watershed and tells us how those recordings are helping to push for the creation of the Indigenous Protected Area. Our third guest today is Angela Waupochick, a PhD student at the University of Wisconsin and a research forester for the Menominee Tribal Enterprises. Wapachik is using bioacoustics to study forest wetlands on Menominee and Stockbridge-Munsee tribal lands in northern Wisconsin. She tells us about how her research project is aimed at devising the best long-term conservation strategies for the black ash-dominated forest wetland ecosystems, the cultural significance of the areas, and why she's so excited that Indigenous high school students are helping her carry out her research.
How fun is it to listen to a recording of all the animals in the forest? And I think that this is going to be a great tool that we can use to help build our workforce and build our tribal students' interest in working in natural resources.
Regular listeners to the Menominee Newscast will be familiar with the K. Lisa Yang Center for Conservation Bioacoustics at Cornell University's Lab of Ornithology, because we've featured the work of the center's researchers on this podcast a number of times. The Center for Conservation Bioacoustics also makes the recording gear and analysis software used by bioacoustic researchers around the world, many of whom we've also had on this podcast. And the Seal River Watershed Alliance is now the latest example. The Alliance and the National Audubon Society are using the Center for Conservation Bioacoustics Swift 1 automated recording units to capture the sounds of the Seal River watershed and demonstrate the rich biodiversity of life that relies on the watershed. Here's Seal River Watershed Alliance Executive Director Stephanie Thorassie to tell us more.
The initiative is the largest IPCA submission in Canada to date. It is 50,000 square kilometers.
IPCA stands for Indigenous Protected and Conserved Area, but you'll also hear us use the shorter acronym IPA for Indigenous Protected Area.
The initiative was started by Sisidena First Nation, which is in the heart of the watershed. We've extended invitations to our neighbors to work with us as a group because we understand how important this area of land is. It crosses different traditional territories, and we understand that it needs to be something that's shared for our future generations and also for other people around the world, because there's not a lot of places like that exist anymore. The land and the water is the same as it's been for hundreds and hundreds of years. And we want to keep it that way because we understand that there are a lot of cultural significant areas in the area, and the territory of the caribou that migrate through there, which is something that really connects us as people as well. And at the mouth of the river is where the belugas have their babies. We have polar bears that roam through. So it's a very unique in that there are lots of different animals that also use the watershed, and birds as well.
In what ways is an Indigenous protected area different from other protected areas like national parks?
IPCAs are created by the local people, by the Indigenous people that are stewarding the lands and who have been stewarding the lands since time immemorial. It's about, I don't like using this word, but it's a word that people often use, is managing according to our own laws and our own traditions and our own values. So rather than having an outside corporation or outside company come in and tell us how we need to manage, I'm doing the air quotes here, manage our lands, when we have our traditional knowledge that spans back further than science that has helped us to steward these lands from the beginning. So this is something that we intend to keep doing.
So you're a member of the Saisi Dene First Nation, which started the initiative, but what are the other Indigenous groups that are part of the Seal River Watershed Alliance?
We are partnered with Northlands Dennis-Tsuut'ina First Nation, Barrenlands First Nation, Opipinapiwin Cree Nation, and we're also partnered with the Hunters and Trappers organization in Arviat Nunavut. So we actually are crossing a territory boundary as well in the work that we're doing.
We're going to listen to recordings made in the Seal River watershed of fox sparrows, nighthawks, ravens, and more. But can you tell us a bit about how bioacoustics are informing the work you're doing to establish this IPA?
The devices that we put up were there as an effort to try and continue to build our case for conservation. So what we're doing with that is we're collecting all of the science, all of the science reasons why we need to protect the area, but we're also pairing that with the Indigenous knowledge that we were actually just out and collecting. We spent approximately 14 days in 4 of the communities in northern Manitoba collecting interviews with elders and land users and youth about the land and about their families' histories and stories of the land. So some of the recordings that we were able to get are really significant in that they are showing just how far some of our migration routes are for some of the birds that I think some of us take for granted, that these beautiful animals are here and that they actually travel so far and wide to use such an immaculate space. The watershed is pristine. You can drink water without having to put anything in the water to drink it. You can fish the lake trout without having to worry about pollution. Like, there's just so much that is there that in the lands that is so important to share with the world because it's such a unique, special place.
Yeah, this obviously is a place that's well worth protecting in its own right. But are there any particular threats to the region that it needs to be protected from?
Well, right now, as it stands, there are no mining stakes in the watershed, and we like to keep it that way. It's such a remote area and place to travel. It's very difficult. There's no roads to this area, just a winter road in the winter, and so it doesn't have a lot of access to outsiders. So we're really lucky in that that's what's kind of helped to keep the area so pristine. But in terms of the reasons why we've been wanting to do this is we need a collective way to work together with our neighbors in the area. We need to start land guardian programs, hopefully, where we can get our own young people and youth out on the land, building careers for themselves. It's about a way to connect the communities and to build stewardship goals and values based off of the community's interests and wants.
So as far as the process of establishing the IPA, where is that at? What is the timeline you're working with?
Well, we've been given a really strict timeline from Environment Climate Change Canada, but because of the COVID-19 pandemic, we were able to extend that by a year. So 2023, I believe, is when we are looking to have the area established under Indigenous law.
Any longer term goals for the IPA you can share with us?
Well, I do want to say that eventually we hope to have some sort of ecotourism set up in the area so that we can welcome guests to visit such a pristine area. We can show people the Northern Lights, or there's already established ecotourism ventures happening along the coast that we're hoping to maybe partner up with. So there will be opportunities in the future, I think, to share some of this with the world, because it is a really, really special, unique place.
Can you leave us with some thoughts on why it's important for Indigenous communities to have control over their lands, and just more generally the importance of Indigenous-led conservation?
Yeah, every aspect of our cultures, our spiritualities, and our identities are rooted in our relationship to the caribou and to the lands that sustain them. In order to be connected to ourselves, the land needs to be safe and it needs to be protected. We want a space for our grandchildren and their grandchildren to exist and to practice their Indigenous rights out on the land as their families have done for as long as people have been walking on the eskers. It's such a special place to be when you go out there and you're standing on the land and you just feel connected to yourself as a person, and as a Dene person or as a Cree person, or even the Inuit that come down to harvest as well. It really gives space to being authentic and true to ourselves.
I'm not sure I know what an esker is.
An esker is a sand hill that before, when there were glaciers and the water was melting, all the runoff from the sand, it formed these, they look like leftover rivers, but they're just huge sand hills that go for miles and miles. They're beautiful. You climb to the top and you can see it's really something special that doesn't exist in a lot of places. I forget about that sometimes.
All right, now we're going to turn to Jeff Wells of the National Audubon Society and take a listen to some of the bioacoustic recordings that have been made as part of the effort to demonstrate the conservation significance of the Seal River Watershed and help to establish the IPA. Wells says that
Indigenous protected areas are kind of a new concept, at least for people in the Western world. An Indigenous protected area is an area that at the outset is protected through an Indigenous government under their own Indigenous law. So, well, I should say an Indigenous protected areas, in some ways, a lot of the conceptual ideas are still evolving, and they change from one part of the world to another and from community to community in exactly like how they're realized and what they mean. But the basic idea is that these are areas that at the outset are declared as protected under Indigenous traditional law by the Indigenous government or community that is the traditional, that is in that traditional territory. In the modern conception, Indigenous protected areas may also have multiple other layers of meaning that come into sort of Western legal traditions, where they could be recognized by federal, international, provincial, state governments, different levels of other kinds of governments as well. And it certainly tends to give them more ability to control what happens on these places when there are multiple layers of protection, so that you don't have a provincial, territorial, state, or national government that ignores it and just goes ahead and allows mining leases or forestry operations to occur or hydropower facilities to be built or whatever it is without the consent or without really the full decision by the Indigenous government or community as to whether they want that to happen or not.
And so 10 automated recording units were set up in the Seal River Watershed to help establish an IPA there?
Yes, we sent up 10 automated recording units, and the community put those all out in early June. And it was interesting because they sent back pictures and video of it. And even in I think they were putting the first ones out in the very last days of May and into early June. And even that late in the season, they were having to do that by snowmobile over the ice on the frozen lakes. And then later on, of course, when they picked them up in late July or in early August, they had to do that by boat.
And we, of course, have a few of the recordings to listen to today. The first is of a fox sparrow. Tell us what we're going to hear in this clip.
So the fox sparrow is a very kind of a large rusty-colored sparrow that people are used to seeing in the winter in much of the U.S. Most of the fox sparrows of the world winter down in the U.S., but they breed in the boreal forest. Their song sounds, some people say it sounds kind of like R2-D2 in the Star Wars movies. I don't know, just a beautiful song that kind of has this ups and downs to it, whistled song that some people think sounds like R2-D2.
All right, let's listen to a fox sparrow in the Seal River Watershed. And we've also got the common nighthawk.
Yeah, the common nighthawk is a pretty cool bird. It's a so-called aerial insectivore, which means it gets all of its food on the wing. It eats insects and captures them on the wing. It's part of a family of birds called nightjars, which are birds that are active either only at night or right at dusk and dawn. And it's a pretty large bird, kind of a wingspan of a couple of feet, I guess. And it looks in flight like a hawk. It has these kind of narrow, sharp wings, and it darts around the sky. That's where the nighthawk part of its name comes from. Its common nighthawks, like many aerial insectivores, have been showing declines across their range. And this has been true of all sorts of birds that eat insects on the wing. There's been really sharp declines. So people have been very concerned about the future of common nighthawks. They're actually on the special concern list in Canada at the national level, and so there's been a lot of attention paid to watching for them. One of the cool things about common nighthawks is they give a call, a very buzzy, beat sort of call that carries from a great distance. So while they're flying around in the evening at dusk, they give that call, and they give it often also while they're in courtship flight. And one of the cool things they do is they dive, the males do this steep dive and make this humming sound with the feathers as they dive, and it's a sound that sounds almost like a jet or something, kind of zoom. And so in the sequence we have, you can hear the peent of the bird high overhead, and then at one point this zoom sound, which you might not even think was a bird, but it is a common nighthawk sound.
And tell us about the common raven.
Yeah, ravens are, of course, a famous bird of the North. Many First Nations have different traditions and stories related to ravens, and you see a lot of symbols of ravens in the North. Ravens are related to crows, which people are familiar with, but bigger and with a very large beak and kind of a wedge-shaped tail. And they're just a striking part of the northern landscape. And on the recordings we have, there's all sorts of sounds of ravens. They make an incredible diversity of sounds. And so we have a clip of some of the more traditional kind of croaking calls of a raven. I think there's a second one in the background a little bit that you can hear as well.
And the next clip we'll hear has more than one bird call in it, right?
Yeah, that's a recording of a northern water thrush singing, and a common loon kind of in the background starts to do a wailing call. So again, gives you a sense of this kind of open northern landscape, these sounds echoing around. But the northern water thrush is a small warbler, despite its name. It's actually a warbler, but it's a warbler that likes to be near water, as you might guess. And so they're often found in tangly areas along waterways and lakes and bogs and things like that, peatlands. And they have a very kind of a loud, striking song that starts off with a few notes, kind of like and a few striking clear notes, and then sort of a jumble of some other ones, and they kind of repeat that over and over, and you can hear that in the recording. And then behind that very distinctive kind of long wailing, kind of lonely sound of a common loon calling from a lake nearby. The northern water thrush is interesting. They actually winter down in the Caribbean, Central America, and South America, and often in mangrove habitats. So they're kind of interesting because they're a bird that's found in high carbon density areas in the north, these kind of wet peatlandy areas that have a lot of carbon in the peat and soil. And then they go to winter in mangroves, which are sometimes called blue carbon forests, because of the great amount of carbon that's stored in mangrove forests on the wintering grounds. So a bird that connects the hemispheres and the whole conceptual idea of storing carbon.
All right, let's take a listen to that recording. And we've got a bonus recording where a northern water thrush is much closer to the mic, so you can hear the call much more clearly. Let's check that out. So these were all recorded with the Swift 1 recording units purchased from the Cornell Lab of Ornithology's Center for Conservation Bioacoustics, and you've sent the data to be analyzed by the center's BirdNet software. Can you tell us a bit about how these bioacoustic recordings are helping you make the case for the Seal River Watershed Indigenous Protected Area?
So many of these places are so remote that we have just very spotty information about what's there, and in what level of abundance, how widespread they are across the landscape, all of those sorts of questions. We just don't know those things for sure for most of the birds. So by using a technique like this, you can put these things out, and, you could imagine if you tried to send people up, they might do a count in one place for one morning for a few minutes, and then they'll move to another place and do that. And so, you get a little bit of information from a few places over time, but it's also often expensive, to send somebody up and, have the supplies and boats and guides and everything to make that happen. Very difficult. So in this case, we were able to just send these units up, and the Indigenous people who are from there and know the land so well can put them out. And we would, like, one recorder will get, typically we may get, 4 hours per day from one place over many weeks. So, you could never really easily replicate that with humans. They just wouldn't be able to spend that much time in a place. And so we can just get a lot more detailed information with these units. And again, in a way that might not even be possible if you were trying to send people up there. And we have, of course, a record of it that can be looked at and analyzed and used in different ways over time, versus if a human just listened and sort of did their best estimate of what was there in the short time they were there. So this is a way we can get lots of information from remote places in partnership, co-created with the Indigenous people of the area, and just get information on what's there and how many. And, the thing that's tricky with any kind of bioacoustics data collection is you collect, a lot of information, massive amounts of data, and it's more information than you could really ever have a person just sit and go through. So you have to have new ways of exploring that data, using new kinds of computer assisted algorithms and things like that. And that's what Cornell's doing, using a machine learning algorithm to try to make it possible to identify as many of the birds as possible and figure that out. There may still be cases where we need to have humans, review what's on some of the recordings and delve into different parts of them and to verify sounds. But the new machine learning algorithms are a way to process this vast amount of data much more quickly. So basically, it's a way to get the standard kind of inventory information about what birds are there and when they're there and how many there are and what habitats they're associated with in a way that was not possible or was prohibitively costly to do with people.
Well, Indigenous-led conservation is obviously of great importance to our efforts to actually safeguard a future for life on this planet. Do you see bioacoustics as playing a big role too?
Indigenous-led conservation is some of the most amazing and sort of forward-leaning conservation happening in the world today. And despite all the bad news we hear about biodiversity loss and climate change, it's always nice to hear some good news stories about people who are thinking really progressively and creatively about how to solve, a part of the twin crises themselves through their leadership. The work across the boreal of Canada, at least, and certainly in other parts of the world as well, are resulting in some of the largest conservation actions, land protection actions happening in the world today. And so many of these areas are not only biodiversity cradles, but they're also carbon storehouses. And so, these are initiatives that are just protecting massive parts of the landscape for the whole world, really, being led by Indigenous people. So it's just exciting to be able to be allies with Indigenous leaders doing this kind of work, and we're trying to find how to best do that. And this kind of work with bioacoustics is a pretty cool way, kind of bringing together modern technology with Indigenous knowledge and perspective and leadership to co-create information that will help move forward the protection of vast landscapes and be part of the solutions to the biodiversity and climate change crises that we're dealing with today.
Now we'll hear from Angela Waupochick about her use of bioacoustics to monitor forest wetlands areas on Menominee and Stockbridge-Munsee tribal lands in northern Wisconsin. Wapachik is using bioacoustic monitoring to record forest soundscapes and study the biodiversity and overall health of the forest ecosystem with an eye towards developing management strategies for the long term.
Previously, I was employed with the Stockbridge-Munsee community, which is a tribal community in northeast Wisconsin. They actually border another tribal community, the Menominee Indian Reservation in northern Wisconsin. At that time, I was a hydrologist, and my task was to manage the water resources for the tribe, which included wetlands. And I had spent the past 10 years building a program to manage wetlands, which largely was restoration and enhancement projects for wetlands that were damaged due to agricultural conversion. Emerald ash borer has not been detected on either reservations, but during my employment there, I was asked by the tribal leadership to start coming up with strategies to manage for emerald ash borer.
The emerald ash borer is a beetle native to northeastern Asia that feeds on ash trees. It's an invasive species in Europe and North America where it is highly destructive and can kill all ash trees within 10 years after its introduction into a new area.
I had no experience with this. I previously worked in forestry, but it was largely wildland fire operations and fuels management. So this was something that I needed to call in the experts for. And it just so happened I knew two researchers that worked for the U.S. Forest Service. Together, we designed a project that helped us characterize our wetlands because these are largely unmanaged areas. These are areas that the tribe hasn't managed, put the effort into management how we have in maybe just our forested areas. In doing so, working with these research foresters, we started monitoring sap flux density of black ash systems. And I realized quickly that this was a large job. And the more and more I learned about black ash forests and realized how abundant they were between both reservations, that this was a full-time job. And with that, I resigned as a hydrologist with the Stockbridge-Munsee community, and I became a PhD student. And this is the only thing that I work on now is trying to find the best management strategies for both tribes to implement as we continue to lose our ash forests due to emerald ash borer.
And how are bioacoustics helping you do that?
So I just recently started using bioacoustics, and like I said before, these areas were unmanaged, largely unmanaged areas. So we don't really know what kind of species are located in these areas, or what is the actual value to wildlife habitat. And this is important now that we want to develop a set of management strategies because we're going to lose this ash component. We want to know what are the considerations for management, and definitely wildlife habitat is at the top of each tribe's list. And this is helping me right now identify or gather a baseline of what are the considerations that we're going to have to implement into these strategies. And also, let's find more efficient ways to understand how our management strategies may or may not be successful in the long term.
Are there specific threats you're trying to mitigate, or is it more all about managing the lands so that potential threats like the emerald ash borer don't ever become problems?
So wetlands in Wisconsin in general have always been threatened by sprawl. Fortunately for both reservations, the Stockbridge-Munsee community and the Menominee Tribal Reservation, we don't have that problem. Our areas are largely left pristine, or I wouldn't say pristine, but they're left, so the natural resources remain intact. A lot of our forested wetlands have been left alone. They haven't been cut. There are some impacts, I would say largely due to insects, or now we're seeing emerald ash borer impacts. I think climate variability has a lot to do with maybe some of the changes, but wetlands are a dynamic environment. They're always changing. And the importance, especially for the Menominee community, is as these are areas that are historically used for crafts, baskets, traditional crafts, including lacrosse sticks, black ash trees in general are just culturally significant trees that have always been within the area or within the landscape of the reservation, and tribal members continue to use them. So when the tree is impacted by emerald ash borer and we start to see these trees fade from the landscape due to impacts from emerald ash borer, that means also that a lot of traditional knowledge and use will be taken away from the tribe.
How many recorders do you have out, and how much data are you collecting from them?
So right now I only have 5 recorders. So I have 8 project sites where I study sap flux density. So I'm looking at really measuring the stand hydrology of these areas. The recorders are programmed for every 15 minutes. And I realized quickly that I'm burning through batteries, and I can't be changing batteries because my sites are scattered over a really large area. So I changed them to every 30 minutes. I don't have a background in wildlife ecology, and really I'm starting to learn species just through this project. But I have a ton of data. In fact, usually at night when I'm working on my writing or my other coursework related to my PhD, I usually play these sounds in the background, and that's how I'm building my library. So I would have weeks and weeks of data that I haven't really looked through yet.
Well, you provided us with one of the soundscape recordings you've made, and we're going to listen to some clips from it. I believe this first one is of a bear sniffing around the recorder.
It is. I think this is really interesting, and this is a plus that I didn't really consider when I started monitoring bioacoustics. Is I'm not at the project sites, and I'm lucky if I can get to the project sites once a week, or maybe once every 2 weeks is a good estimate of how often I visit these sites. And I have measuring for sap flux density is very high maintenance, and a lot of these sensors that I put into the tissues of the tree are often destroyed by wildlife. And a lot of times I don't have tracks because these are inundated areas. There's not a lot to go on. So when I started measuring bioacoustics, I could actually pinpoint the culprit. In this one particular site that we're going to listen to, which is what we call Pazer site, I have a resident bear that lives there. And over time, I was starting to see, okay, here's his claw mark on the heat shield that I put it around the tree to make sure that the outside temperature doesn't interfere with my sensory in the tree tissue. So the clip that we're going to hear now is actually him walking through the wetland, and then also he spotted a new recorder. So I put the recorder in a different spot because actually he found it previously. So now he found it 7 feet in another tree.
All right, well, we're going to listen to this clip. You'll hear the bear walking around in this wetlands area for a second as he approaches the audio recorder, and then you'll hear him sniffing around the recorder itself. And we've got a short clip of a bird call here. What can you tell us about this one?
Many different bird species usually are, it depends. I have there's a lot of variability between sites. And even though that some of my sites are only maybe a mile away from each other, and some miles in some areas are maybe 4 miles away from each other, there's a lot of variability in between that. And I think it's fascinating that, these are plots that I picked out specifically because they all had a certain hydrology type, and they all had, certain ground vegetation or certain trees. But yet I hear a lot of variability between the bird species. And really I have to understand what's going on, in the entire landscape. Why are these birds utilizing this area? And what are the considerations that, as a land manager, that we should have going forward?
All right, let's hear this bird from the same site as the bear. So you're using bioacoustic monitoring essentially to put together baseline data on the ecosystem that can inform future management strategies. But you also think bioacoustics are a great way to get younger students interested in ecology and forest management, right?
So I started out, my PhD or my dissertation is largely focused on black ash hydrology, and this opportunity came up, and I pursued it. And although it's not the main focus of my dissertation, it's my favorite. And one other thing that another part of my dissertation is focusing on workforce development for the tribal forestry program. And how do we get our young tribal members interested in working as land managers or foresters? Right now I have students from Menominee Indian High School that work as research assistants on my projects, on my research, just because I live so way up north compared to UW-Madison, and it's quite a haul. So it made sense for me to use tribal members or tribal students on my project because they live there. They're accustomed, they're primed to understand, how to get around our forest and the landscape. But using this bioacoustic monitoring, I think is going to be a great start, or just a great tool for tribal students to get an interest in working in natural resources. For me, I'm studying sap flux density, and it's really hard to get excited about sap running through a tree because you can't see it. And the monitoring is very enduring and high maintenance, but how fun is it to listen to a recording of all the animals in the forest? And I think that this is going to be a great tool that we can use to help build our workforce and build our tribal students' interest in working in natural resources.
So what are the next steps for this research project and all of the acoustic data you're gathering? And how you turn this into a long-term management regime for the ecosystem.
I'm pretty much in my preliminary stages. So I'm just right now going over the first 2 years of data that I've collected, but that is the ultimate goal. When I get done with my graduate studies here, I intend to go back and be a forest manager or someone working in our community and natural resources. And I think, and really, what I'm doing here is, I didn't need to come back to do my PhD. I wanted to because I knew this was a system that I wanted to manage long term, and I needed more guidance to do that. And by building this bioacoustic library, I think that not only am I collecting baseline data for these black ash stands, but I'm also developing a library that probably can be applied to the entire forest. So we manage the forest, and I think that this is going to be integral or just very efficient way to assess how we manage the entire forest.
If you enjoy the Mongabay Newscast, we ask that you please help spread the word by telling a friend. That's the best way to help expand our reach and keep the show growing. Another way to help is by becoming a monthly sponsor via our Patreon page at patreon.com/Mongabay. We are a nonprofit news outlet, so just $1 or more per month would really help us offset production costs and hosting fees. If you're a fan of our audio reports from Nature's Frontline, please head to patreon.com/Mongabay to learn more and support the Mongabay Newscast. You and your friend can join the listeners who've downloaded the Mongabay Newscast more than 250,000 times by subscribing to this podcast wherever you get your podcasts from. Or you can download our app for Apple and Android devices. Just search either app store for the Mongabay Newscast app to gain fingertip access to all of our new shows and all of our previous episodes. And of course, you can read all of our news and inspiration from Nature's Frontline at mongabay.com. Or if you prefer to keep up with us on social media, follow us at facebook.com/Mongabay, or on Twitter and Instagram. Our handle is @Mongabay on both those platforms. Thanks as always for listening to the Mongabay Newscast. I'm your host, Mike Gorecki, signing off. Talk to you again in 2 weeks.